So just a very, very quick note here. The blurb, the abstract, was from whenever we had to put this in, and things have migrated intellectually from then to now. Not totally, but this is very fresh, and I'm happy to be able to speak about something that is fairly new for me. Okay, without further ado. So, as it is known today, Al-Fiyashiyya, this famous poem that we heard a little bit about today from Professor Shatrit, is a strikingly Moroccan and Sufi sung poem or qasida that exists on the margins of the canon of Maghribi colloquial poetry known as Malhoun. In its maximal version, as found in contemporary anthologies, it numbers approximately 30 verses, each verse made up of, depending on how you divide it up, 8 lines, with the first 4 being somewhat more classical than the remainder. In actual performance, singers usually confine themselves to about 6 verses. Its popular title derives from the refrain أنا ماني فياش اشعل لي مني نقلق من رزقي لاش والخالق يرزقني. Now, how do you translate this first part? Some people translate as I do not complain, I do not fear. Others as I do not boast. What do I care? And the second line, نقلق من رزقي لاش, is why worry about my sustenance when the Creator sustains me? Like many of the poems associated with the Malhoun canon, Al-Fiyashiyya is linked to the pre-colonial early modern period and is attributed to an individual who is sometimes named in the final verse, in this case, unsung verse. Now, while some versions name someone named Yahya Sharqi, there's a long list of people it's been attributed to, and it's also sometimes simply associated with El-Bahrul, Sidi El-Bahrul, which could be a fool or a fool of God. Despite the many questions about who these names refer to and the wider question of its prominence, the content of the poem and subsequent performance associations have helped solidify the notion that the author was a Sufi figure, and the usual dating is to sometime in the 17th century. Now, there is something interesting happening here with attempts to show video. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to tell you, it's a really great video. Go look it up. The link is here, right? And it's basically, the refrain. أنا ماني فياش اشعل لي مني نقلق من رزقي لاش والخالق يرزقني. Although Chaim Luke sings it, and you have to see because there's a lot of interesting interaction going on. So. The question here, this is an answer to, what do Jews have to do with Al-Fiyashiyya? Now, we saw this morning that, in fact, there is a kind of a deep kind of subterranean connection, and we can clearly see from this very lively performance with Abderrahim Swiri and Chaim Luke, this moment of kind of joint performance. Now, while it is sometimes sung by Moroccan Jews, and I'm talking about not the melody, but the text, because the melody circulates, right? As far as I know, this is always today in the context of a performance alongside Moroccan Muslims. And I'd love to be corrected on this, but that's my experience. It is a more or less safe text for such purposes that it expresses a Maghribi monotheism that is not necessarily specifically Muslim. A Jew and a Muslim singing this together, like in this phantom video, helps to perform a certain kind of Moroccanness, one that is characterized by strong monotheistic conviction that is not specified as particular to Muslims or Jews. At the same time, the fact that this is something Jewish performers sometimes sing when with Muslims and not, don't worry about it, I'm gonna just, it's not super
we'll just have him sing the whole thing.
Right, yeah. Okay, so at the same time, the fact that this is something Jewish performers sometimes sing when with Muslims and not, as far as I know, in an intra-Jewish context, suggests that this is at base understood to be Muslim, but Muslim in a way that can be de-specified and extended in order to accommodate Jews, though not without controversy. If you take a look at the comments in this video, it's full of controversy in terms of like what's going on here, right? In other words, if we picture a continuum between 2 points, one marked as borrowing, and the other marked as sharing, Al-Fiyashiyya seems to exist closer to the borrowing side today, but not wholly so. A Jewish performer can take responsibility for the import of its words, even if the space in which the performance takes place is self-consciously one of Muslim-Jewish interface, and the poem is understood to spring most immediately from a Muslim context. So, given the contemporary social life of Al-Fiyashiyya and the background usually ascribed to it, I was surprised when I found a 6-verse version of Al-Fiyashiyya in Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew manuscript from Spanish-ruled Oran in Algeria, conserved at the Bodley in Oxford, and often known as the Mahzor Oran, likely dating to the second half of the 17th century, probably mainly before the Oran Jewish community's expulsion mainly to Livorno in 1669. This manuscript is associated with the famous Cancino family, who served over generations as interpreters to the city's Spanish rulers. I was surprised to find such a seemingly Sufi text in a manuscript apparently meant for use within a specifically Jewish paraliturgical context. I was also surprised to see this in a Hebrew letter manuscript from a period close in time to when the poem is usually said to have been composed. Indeed, I do not know of any Maghribi manuscript older than this containing a version of Al-Fiyashiyya, whether in Hebrew or Arabic orthography. If we permit ourselves to draw links between Jewish practices across time, the most immediate lesson seems to be that Al-Fiyashiyya has been part of Maghribi Jewish practice far longer than I personally had ever thought. Now my question today is what the presence of Al-Fiyashiyya here in his manuscript means for thinking about the relationship between borrowing and sharing. A problem that might sound rather modest, but I think goes quite deep. I want to get at this in a few steps. First, I want to briefly contextualize Al-Fiyashiyya in the Mahzor Oran. Then I want to talk at some length about several reasons that the borrowing explanation is both problematic and overdetermined with regard to Al-Fiyashiyya as well as other Arabic language texts, both in this manuscript and beyond. Then I want to talk about some possible ways out from such an explanation that brings us more firmly into the realm of sharing, but that also require us to conceptually differentiate between sharing and participation. Okay, so first, the larger context. Al-Fiyashiyya is by no means the only Arabic language text in the Mahzor Oran. Arabic language texts appear in two different ways here. First, throughout all 4 volumes, as ubiquitous melodic indicators at the beginning of a Hebrew text, as in, sing to the tune of X. And second, in the last third of one of the 4 volumes, as actual discrete poetic texts to be sung in their own right. Nearly all of these Arabic poems are found within a series organized under the rubric of tariq, found in this section of the Mahzor. Tariq, an Arabic term denoting path, is familiar from later Maghribi Jewish paraliturgical practice, in which a series of texts, usually Hebrew, are brought together under a single melodic mode. This appears to be the governing concept here. 4 of the 7 tariqs in this final section name the melodic mode at the very beginning of the sequence. The number of texts grouped into a single tariq range from as few as 1 or 2 to as many as 31, with the exception of a single very short tariq entirely in Hebrew. All of them combine texts in Hebrew with texts in Arabic, with some occasionally intermingling of lines and phrases in a single text. Another distinctive feature of the tariq section of this volume is the presence of certain poetic or musical genre markers that are not found elsewhere in the Mahzor, as well as the absence of many of the liturgical and ritual headings that are ubiquitous in other parts of the manuscript. This underlines the somewhat more musical, somewhat less liturgical character of the tariq. With this general background, let's look more closely at the tariq, where we can find Al-Fiyashiyya. This tariq, composed of 5 texts, does not name its mode. Like most of the others, it begins in Arabic, here with a text beginning Dim'i ala khaddi, my tear is on my cheek. After this, there's a short Hebrew text shaped around the alphabet, Aleph amalel, Aleph I will speak. Then there is a shift back to Arabic with Wentina andi ya khad al-wardi, you are mine, O rosy-cheeked one. Then this is followed by Al-Fiyashiyya, one of the very few Arabic texts in the entire tariq section of the manuscript that explicitly focuses on religious questions. Finally, the tariq closes with a short Hebrew text, Chazak Goel, strong as the Redeemer. Thus, like most of the others, this tariq displays a rough alternation of Arabic and Hebrew and ends in Hebrew. The Arabic texts here and elsewhere bring us directly into this question of borrowing. So earlier I spoke of a continuum between borrowing and sharing, but a continuum sounds evenly balanced, when in fact, among various commentators, the evaluative scale has traditionally been strongly tipped toward borrowing. This position is well established in Jewish music scholarship. It basically treats the presence of non-Hebrew vernacular poems and songs in Jewish manuscript culture as a borrowing from the non-Jewish surround. In some sense, the idea of Jewish borrowing from the linguistic and musical surround makes a lot of sense. But there are also many practical and ideological aspects of this position that I think it is worth drawing attention to and pushing back against. I want to walk through a few of them now and discuss how the Oran manuscript complicates them. The first is, in fact, an insider discourse, particularly a rabbinic discourse. There are examples of multiple medieval rabbis in Iberia and North Africa who conceptualized the Hebrew text as the Jewish core and the melodies shared with local vernaculars as borrowed from a non-Jewish source. So this is an insider discourse. While certainly interesting as an ideological position, there are a number of reasons to be critical that I would like to get to momentarily. But the first thing I want to point out is that one corollary of this position is that it tends to map language onto the sacred-profane contrast. Now, this might seem like a commonsensical mapping, but while it is true that there are no obviously profane Hebrew texts in the Mahzor Oran, at least not on par with some of the Arabic texts found there, it is also true that there are some Arabic texts that focus on the sacred. Yes, most of the Arabic texts are quite profane, sometimes literally so. However, there are at least two texts in Arabic that clearly focus on the sacred. One of these is a text that begins, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, found in the preceding tariq. And one of these is a text, immediately following a Hebrew text marked piyut that begins El Elohim Ashir Bashirati, which is God, I will sing my song, and that instructs the singer to use the meter of La ilaha illallah to sing this piyut. And the other, of course, is Al-Fiyashiyya. So while the Hebrew texts reinforce the association of Hebrew with the sacred, and while many of the Arabic texts reinforce the association of Arabic with the profane, these two examples complicate an overly rigid mapping of language on the sacred-profane contrast. Indeed, it brings to mind for me the later practice in Western Algeria of describing some Arabic poems by Paitanim as piyutim bil-Arabi, right? So piyutim or paraliturgical poems in Arabic. Now, someone could come back and say, yes, the strict mapping of the sacred-profane contrast onto language is not entirely fair in the North African Jewish context. But surely the rabbinic interpretation of such terms is generally accurate for the bulk of the ways in which Arabic song texts appear here, i.e. as melody indicators or as standalone poems that mainly dwell on erotic themes. And surely it is fair to say that these profane examples are examples of borrowing from the non-Jewish surround. Now, I would argue that such position is not only consonant with a certain medieval rabbinic discourse, but also has diverse modern echoes. One of these is the nationalist notion of a people that largely lost its cultural patrimony, was forced to borrow from others, and in the Zionist version of such a narrative, more recently has had the opportunity to recover, restore, or reinvent that patrimony. So whether in its rabbinic version or its nationalist version, what is the problem with the borrowing paradigm? Say, when we talk about the bulk of the Arabic poems in the manuscript. The main thing is that such a view misses the way in which Maghrebi Jews may not have been borrowing, but instead in participating in, perhaps even contributing to vernacular song. This sort of participation is precisely the sort of thing that would show up in Jewish manuscript culture only sporadically. But take, for example, the first two major tariqs in this section of the document attributed here to Rav Marzouk, perhaps the Granadan-born Marzouk bin Tawa of Tlemcen. There are many questions regarding what the attribution of these tariqs to Rabbi Marzouk actually means, but obviously one possibility is that this is an attribution of authorship. And even if we sidestep the question of authorship, participation carries very different resonances from borrowing. Yet even participation carries its own traps that ironically push us back toward the borrowing side of the continuum. For example, a certain Zionist version of the borrowing paradigm has received a strong critique in the work of Ella Shohat, who seeks to underline Arabic-speaking Jews' full participation in Arabic expressive culture. But while Shohat is making some important points, I'm struck by the way in which her critique too reinforces the borrowing paradigm, in that her emphasis on Jewishness as religion rather than nation, both modern and pre-modern notion of nation, similarly sequesters Jewishness in Hebrew and the sacred. In other words, Shohat is buying into a classically liberal position, the one that shares elements with the medieval rabbinic mapping of the Jewish onto Hebrew and the sacred, and the non-Jewish onto the profane vernacular. In this instantiation here, it is in essence an Arab nationalist position that envisions Arabic as a secular space in which Arabic-speaking Jews fully participated in spite of their internal religious communal specificities. But what if we shift things to allow for something else? A situation in which Jews' engagement with profane Arabic poetry is not partitioned off from some pure Jewish kernel, but rather is coextensive with a capacious Jewish subjectivity. And if this is coextensive, how do we conceptualize the element that is shared with non-Jews? I can think of a few different ways. A tempting way to get at this is through the idea of the Islamicate proposed by Marshall Hodgson, a middle ground between the Islamic and the non-Islamic, potentially inclusive of non-Muslims living in predominantly Muslim societies. An advantage of thinking about this profane realm of participation as the Islamicate is that it can also include Muslims, acting as a sort of profane space. On the one hand, this allows us to take to heart Talal Asad's admonition that not everything that Muslims say and do belongs to an Islamic discursive tradition, and even propose a profane commons that carries less of the Christian and Eurocentric baggage of the secular. On the other hand, the Islamicate preserves the idea of a split between the Muslim as Muslim and all those other activities that Muslims participate in, not unlike the sequestering of Jewishness in the sacred and leaving everything else as other. In other words, Asad's differentiation between an Islamic discursive realm rooted in the Quran and Hadith and a non-Islamic realm imports some of the same secular assumptions that he elsewhere critiques. The notion of the Islamicate also leaves the problem of what to do with something like Al-Fiyashiyya. Is this Islamic or Islamicate? And if it is properly Islamic, how do we explain its presence among Jews? An easy way out, of course, is to simply say that the Islamic and the Islamicate have fuzzy boundaries. But another possibility is to follow Shahab Ahmed, his fascinating book, What is Islam?, and question the sequestering of the Muslim from the Islamicate. So while Ahmed shares various things with Asad, he questions this idea that we can separate the Islamic and the Islamicate. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to a kind of concluding set of points here. So if we take Ahmed's monist approach, what advantage does it give us? One is analogical. Ahmed's Islam and being Muslim start to look more similar to some ways of seeing Judaism and Jewishness. In other words, both Jews and Muslims face the modern question of just how human are they? Does the humanity of Jews and Muslims begin where their Jewishness and Muslimness break off, or is their Jewishness and Muslimness coeval with their humanness? And the other advantage is connective. So in the context of the Oran manuscript, what Ahmed argues about Muslims and Islam might be extended to Jews and Judaism. Just as Jews sustained engagement with a kind of Arabic poetic forms, such as what we see in Dim'i ala Khaddi and Wentina Andi can be seen as fully Jewish, so too the engagement with Al-Fiyashiyya can bring it into a Jewish system of meaning. Indeed, Al-Fiyashiyya in some ways can be read as a Tayyut bil-Arabi, but this time one that also happens to be part of Muslim paraliturgical practice. So instead of borrowing and instead of even participation, Ahmed's approach allows us to view a text like Al-Fiyya as an actual sharing of material within distinct, though overlapping systems. So what I'm not going to be able to talk about, just because of the time constraint, is the question of the authorship and the provenance of Al-Fiyashiyya. So once we start to dig around in the kind of the manuscript sources, what we can find is there's a very, very wide reach of Al-Fiyashiyya that goes well beyond the Maghreb, and that actually looks like it's quite a bit older than the 17th century. So we can find a section, a kind of Mashriqi version here from the Mutawwal of Taftazani, copied in the 17th century in Syria. And we can also find some really fascinating examples from Samaritan manuscripts, thanks to Hasib Shahada, who's done some work from the similar period. So I'm going to stop there, and if you ask the right question, I'll give you my concluding paragraph.